This morning, I'm going to entitle my presentation Elements of the World. And all I'm going to do is to delve a little deeper into something that we have discussed to some extent already. But I want to delve a little deeper into it because this is what we have been doing. And this is what I think we are going to be doing from now until the Lord comes. You know, we look at the things that we already understand and the things we already believe. And we see how the Lord gives us deeper insight, deeper understanding. You know, this morning, even this morning, when I went to pray, what came to my mind is that it's very, very difficult. We have said it, but it comes back from time to time. It's very difficult for a person to be completely free from the ideas of the past. Even this morning, while I was having a little time in prayer, I was aware of some questions in my mind and some attitudes that I know are wrong. I know they are wrong. What I mean is, do you come before God at times and you feel like you're in danger of not being accepted? Do you come before God sometimes and you feel like I am not perfect, I made some mistakes? And you find yourself in this position and you find yourself falling back into the old concepts of God being angry and God being upset and God being in a mood where he will say, I'm not willing to save you because you have let me down. And I realized that we are the product of the ideas that are in our heads. And sometimes we change our ideas, but the relics of those ideas remain. And I suppose this is why Paul says we are to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, because though we are born again and we have a new spirit, we still need to re-educate some of those old ideas out of our heads. I mean, Sister Leanne, it's going to be the elements of the world. That's what I'm going to talk. That's what I've addressed. I've labeled this little talk, the elements of the world. So the most important thing that I believe is important, the most significant thing I believe in the Christian experience is our relationship with God. And our relationship with God is largely dependent upon our concept of God, our understanding of God. I know that God is eminently wise. I know that God is eminently mighty. He's almighty. There's no limit to his power. I know that God is our king and he's our creator. The thing that is most difficult to really process and to internalize is the idea that God is my friend and he will never be anything except my friend. And the reason why I keep emphasizing this, like I said last week, is because you know, a friend is somebody who is with you whether you succeed or whether you fail. A true friend. You know, they talk about fair weather friends, but in the Bible it talks about a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And like I said this last week, and I'm going to repeat it. A brother is fine, but a brother is in your life because he was born that way. He can't get away. A father is fine, but a father is in your life because you were born into his life. You can't get away. A king is fine but a king is your king because you're born in his kingdom. You fall under his government. But why is somebody your friend? That's why I like friend when it comes to God. A person is your friend because he chooses on the basis of who you are and who he is. He chooses to associate with you. He's not in the relationship because it's a necessity. He chooses, and he can choose to give up that relationship if he wants. So the concept of God as my friend is very precious to me. And I think of the implications of friendship, and I realize that a friend is somebody who he understands your weaknesses and he chooses to be with you anyway. A friend is somebody that you're disappointed, but he chooses to be with you anyway. A friend is somebody that you do the wrong thing and he's there to help you to get out of it. He's not going to throw you under the bus, he's there to help you to escape from the problem. The hardest obstacle to this picture is the picture that is presented of God in the Old Testament. That's why it is the hardest question in the Bible. It's the hardest question in the Bible. Of all the challenges that I've faced, this is the greatest one. How to perfectly explain why God showed this face in the Old Testament. I'm very happy that I think I'm about 80% in being able to understand it. I'm very happy. And I've tried to share this with us, but I still would like a more perfect way of expressing some of these things, because I think that's the greatest obstacle, because you do have a picture of a God who is sometimes angry, who loses control, and who takes vengeance, and who harbors hard feelings against you that goes from generation to generation. And we have come to understand it. We're understanding it, and it's a great relief. But sometimes I find that when you come short of the mark, you find yourself coming to God with your head hanging down and not quite sure if you're going to be accepted. And I'm so grateful that I've found out that He's my friend in bad times and in good times. And it is the thing we want to hold before our eyes, this concept of God. And every doctrine in the Bible that we study, if we understand the truth, it is zeroing in on this great reality. What kind of person is God, and how should we relate to this God? Anyway, what I want to look at this morning is also zeroing in on that direction. It's pointing to the more perfect way of relating to God. And I hope that by God's grace, that as we study this morning, the main emphasis that I want to make will come out. So I want to start by looking at 1 Corinthians 3, verse 3, and I want to point out something that I'm sure we all agree with. I want to emphasize that carnal in the Bible is something bad. It's usually represented as something bad. See what Paul says. He's talking to the Corinthians who are having all these problems, and he says, for in 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 3, he says, for you are yet carnal, you are still carnal. For where there is among you envying and strife and divisions, are you not carnal and walk as men? There's a reason why I'm focusing on the word carnal. I know we're talking about elements of the world, but I want to begin with talking about carnal. Paul says, if you have envy and you have division and you have quarrels, argument, fighting, you are carnal. But he says something else interesting. He says, you are carnal and you walk as men. That is interesting. Are we not men? Are we not men and women? Are we not mankind, I should say? My apologies to the women. We are mankind. We are men and women. And Paul says, he blames them because he says, you're walking as men. And we know the word walk means you're behaving. It's your manner of living. He says, you are living like men. And he suggests that we should not be living like men. We should not be living like human beings. And that is interesting, because what he's suggesting is that there is a manner of life that is associated with human beings, and we do not belong in that category. That behavior should not be associated with us. And of course, he explains what he's talking about. He says there's envy, and there's strife, and there's division. And he says if you are involved in this, it means that you are carnal. And carnal means that you are walking like people. Carnal means that you are behaving like human beings. That is what he's saying, which is interesting because I'm sure the question that comes to mind immediately is, well, we are men, are we not? We are human beings, are we not? How could we behave as anything other than human beings? I'll show you another place where he says something similar. Romans chapter 8. And I'm going to read verses 6 and 7. Even though we're very familiar with this passage, I want to look at it again. Paul says, for to be carnally minded. And now he adds something that helps us a little bit because he's not talking about carnal per se, it seems. He's talking about carnal minded. So that adds something. Carnal in itself is not the problem Paul is having with these people. It's the carnal mind. All right, that gives us some kind of greater understanding because you're thinking, I am human and I can't escape from humanity. Fine. Paul is not saying to get out of the world and get out of this body. He's saying get out of that way of thinking. It's the mind, it's a carnal mind that he's talking about. So when Paul says, are you not carnal and walk as men? What he means is, don't you have the same mind like human beings have? And so he says, for to be carnally minded is death. It breeds death. You are living in death and you will end up dead. So, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. So the converse of carnal is spiritual. And again, it's interesting because just to highlight the point, Paul is not saying you are to become a spiritual being literally because, there is a spiritual body just like there is a physical body. Paul is talking about the mind that is spiritual and the mind that is carnal. Obviously, the carnal mind is living the way of human beings, and the spiritual mind is living the life of God and of those who dwell in that spiritual realm. And Paul says to have this kind of mind is life and peace. He says, because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can it be. So, this is why it is very important for us to understand that if a person is to become a genuine Christian, he has to have a new mind. His mind has to be, he has to have a different kind of mind. He has to go through an experience that takes him from being simply human and makes him more than human. Sometimes I've thought about the song that says, I'm only human. I'm just a man. Lord, help me believe in what I could be and what and all that I am. But the primary principle of the song makes me balk a little bit because the song is speaking, I suppose, as a carnal person. Because when you're a Christian, if you say I'm only human, what you're doing, you're denying the reality of what God has done for you. I mean, I sing the song, it's a nice song, but when you think of the theology of some of the songs, it's a little daunting because in some of the things that are being emphasized, it's not correct according to what you can see in the Bible. If you're only human, it means you have not yet received the Spirit of Christ. Paul says this kind of mind, the mind that is only human, that is carnal, is enmity against God. It is inherently antagonistic towards God. It does not like God. It is afraid of God. It does not want to come close to God. It does not want to submit to God. And he says it cannot be. The problem is not effort. The person with a carnal mind may make effort to serve God. But what the Bible says is that it is impossible. It cannot be. The problem is not lack of effort. The problem with the carnal mind is not lack of effort. The problem is the mind itself. And that tells you that the only way this problem can be dealt with is to have a new mind. The person with the carnal mind needs to have a change. His mind needs to be changed. And when we say mind here, of course, we are referring to the spirit. The spirit needs to be changed. But I want to show you, make another point. And the point I want to make, we have looked at the word carnal, and we have seen where the word carnal is used in a negative way. It refers to something that is bad. The carnal mind is enmity against God. But I'm going to show you also that carnal itself is not bad. If you look at Romans 15, verse 27, look at what it says. It hath pleased them verily, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister unto them in carnal things. Now, Paul is talking about offerings being collected for the poor believers in Jerusalem. And what he's saying is that the Gentiles have benefited from the spiritual legacy that was given to the Jews. And so the Gentiles have a duty to minister to these poor believers by giving their carnal things. He refers to carnal things. Now remember the first verse we looked at. Let me just go back to that verse very quickly. And it says, here are the things he mentioned when he mentions carnal: envy, strife, divisions. Those are the things that he mentions when he talks about carnal. And yet here now, Paul is saying to the Gentile believers that their duty is to minister to these Jewish carnal things. He uses the same word, carnal. But in this case, I'm sure you know, he's not talking about something bad. When he mentioned it to the Corinthians, he was talking about their bad behavior. Here, he's not mentioning bad behavior. He's talking about their money, their crops, whatever goods they have that can benefit a person in this fleshly life. All that Paul means here when he talks about carnal, he's referring to worldly goods. When somebody wants to donate to the ministry and somebody sends a check, they're giving up their carnal things. The other morning, a couple of weeks ago, my wife and I found a bag on the veranda, and it had some stuff in it. I can't find out who it was, even though I don't know who left it there. But it had some ground food and some salt, among other things, and we have no idea who it was. But whoever it was, they ministered of their carnal things. So carnal in this sense is not bad. It simply means, what does it mean in this sense? If you say they have been made partakers of their spiritual things, I believe that right now, what I'm doing, brothers and sisters, I'm ministering spiritual things. Because what I'm giving you is ideas. What I'm giving you is information. I'm not giving you something you can eat or hold in your hands or wear as clothing. I'm giving you something that goes into your head, and hopefully it will affect your spirit and your spiritual life. So I'm ministering spiritual things. Physical things are opposed to spiritual things, but Paul refers to these physical things as carnal things. It's things that pertain to this life and this flesh. It's not necessarily bad. But many times when the word carnal is used, it's referring to the bad aspects of this life, because this fleshly life is the life that is associated with sinful behavior and sinful performance. This is why he refers to the bad behavior as carnal behavior, because it's flesh behavior. The flesh is a place where sinful behavior emerges and demonstrates itself. So let's look at another example, or a couple of other examples where we see that the word carnal is not necessarily bad. Again, in 1 Corinthians, the same Corinthians, in chapter 9 and verse 11, look at what Paul says. Paul says, if we have sown unto you spiritual things, is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? So it's kind of very clear in this particular verse. Paul says, we have sown unto you spiritual things. We have shared spiritual benefits and blessings. I mean, in the case of Paul, it probably was more than I am trying to do. I'm giving you ideas, I'm giving you information, I'm giving you biblical understanding. But I think in the case of Paul, he actually laid hands on these people and they received the baptism of the Spirit. So it might have meant a little bit more in the case of Paul than it means maybe for many of us today. But Paul says, we have given you spiritual things, we have sown, we have planted. Is it a great thing if we shall reap your carnal things? So the point I want to make is that you can clearly see that spiritual things are referring to the things of the mind, the things of the spirit, while the carnal things are referring simply to the things of the flesh. Paul almost seems to be pointing to some kind of swap or exchange. We give you spiritual things, you give us back carnal things. All right, so I suppose I can understand why he's saying this, because sometimes somebody may say, the idea might arise in somebody's mind. What are you giving? I sit down and I listen to you. What are you giving? It's like many times we have gone out handing out tracts. And, you know, Jamaican people tend to be outspoken and sometimes they talk too much. But many times you find people on the road and you try to hand them a tract and they say, what are you giving me that for? What is that good for? Give me money. Very bold and barefaced with it. They don't beat around the bush. And what they are suggesting is that what you're offering me is valueless. What you need to give me is something material. And it's an expression of the kind of value that people have for spiritual things. They don't value it. Christians should be different. And I think Christians are different. I think the people in this room are different. You recognize that when somebody is giving you spiritual food, you recognize that they are giving you something more precious than life. You recognize this. But generally speaking, in society, the carnal mind appreciates carnal things, not spiritual. And so people think that if you don't give them something that they can put in their pocket or push in their mouth, you are giving them nothing. But Paul is putting things in perspective and he says, look here, if we have given you spiritual things, it's not a great thing if we reap your carnal things. He's saying there's a kind of exchange, right? One hand washes the other. He's talking about two different worlds, physical and spiritual, but he's also acknowledging that though we live in the spiritual world, we still need to survive in the physical world. So this balance that God set up is a good thing. That's what he's saying. But again, the point I want to make is that carnal is not necessarily bad. In 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 4, he says, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. When he says our weapons are not carnal, it doesn't mean that we're not using swear words and we're not using malice and backbiting and so on. It just simply means, when he says carnal here, it simply means things that pertain to the flesh. We're not using swords, we're not using guns, we're not using bombs. That's not our fight. We're not using fierce contention. No, we don't fight in this way. And to fight in this way is to be carnal. The worldly person, the carnal person, depends on the weapons of this world. I myself feel very strongly about it. I mean, not necessarily even in fighting, but even in the realm of health. I know that there's a lot of contention and disagreement about using the vaccine or going to the doctor or using drugs and all the different remedies. And I myself don't take an oath against using medicine or even going to the doctor. I don't take an oath against it. But at the same time, I am not going to be submitting to any of those things unless God sends me. That is my position. Why? I have an inherent resentment. I have an inherent resentment that the world depends on these things, that these are the elements that the world depends upon, and that I have the same dependence. I have an inherent resentment about it. And maybe you can take that for what it is worth, but I am not putting using those things in the category of sin. I'm not doing this. So nobody should misunderstand me. But what I'm saying is that, some years ago I read an article that I think I shared here, but it was put out in the magazine Psychology Today, where they were saying that atheism is going to take over from religion, and they were saying the world has replaced Christianity in all the areas that are important. You don't need God for healing because you have medicine. You don't need God for money because you have the bank. You don't need God for worship and fine feelings because you have sport and you have the ability to have entertainment, go to the movies. So you don't need God for those psychological boosters. And from the moment I read it, I was deeply resentful, because I realized it's kind of true that the world, Satan, has conjured up replacements for religion. So when somebody says, look here, God gave these people the wisdom to know how to heal disease and how to do this and how to do that, I'm not going to argue with you, but I have my own convictions and I have my own resentment. That a man who is an atheist should be working on me to bring healing, should be working on me to bring healing. I know they are Christian doctors, but I know a lot of them are atheists. That the technology of humanity should be put in a place where people come to depend on technology above God, because God is unrealistic. If you talk, they will say, look how many Christians depend on God and they die. So depend on the doctor and live. I am inherently resentful about it. All right, so that's a by the way. That's not my main thought, but it just came to my mind as I see where Paul says, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. To me, depending on these things is depending on carnal things. Remember, as we pointed out, carnal is not necessarily bad. It simply means of the world. When Paul says we don't fight carnally, he means we don't use swords. We don't use the weapons that are used in this world. And it applies not just to fighting a war, physical war, but we can apply to all areas of our life, because the principle remains the same. And I want to repeat, don't think that I'm condemning anybody if you find it necessary to utilize any of these means, these elements. I'm just saying that in my mind, I am inherently uneasy about it. And if you become involved in it, make sure that you counsel with the Lord first. Make sure you counsel with the Lord first. To default to the ways of the world without counseling with God, to me, that is where you have a problem. When you counsel with the Lord and He sends you, all of us have to shut our mouths. We have nothing to say. But I think it is damaging to your experience as a Christian when you fall upon carnal solutions when God did not send you. That's what I think. At the very least, you will harm your faith. I'll show you furthermore where carnal is even good at times in some ways. Look at Hebrews 9 and verse 1. It says, then verily, truly, the first covenant had also ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. So even in the worship of God, carnal things were used. Now, it does not say carnal here, but if you look at a little further down, let me look at verse 10 and you'll see where the word carnal is used. As a matter of fact, from what we have seen so far, you will understand that worldly simply means carnal. It means of this world. And if you look at verse 10, it kind of supports my point. It says in verse 10, which stood, he means the worship of that sanctuary, which stood only in meats and drinks and divers washings and carnal ordinances. The word carnal is used, imposed on them until the time of Reformation. What I want to point out is that even in the worship of God was established on carnal things. carnal ceremonies, carnal ordinances. And as I said, the word carnal simply means of this world. And so Paul says that they had a worldly sanctuary. We could interchange the word, and we could say they had a carnal sanctuary. So primarily, brothers and sisters, when the Bible talks about carnal, it is talking about things of this world. And of course, when you talk about carnal behavior, you are meaning worldly behavior, and the behavior of the world is usually bad. That's why when somebody says you have a carnal mind, it means you have a mind like the world. It usually means something bad. But I want to emphasize the point. Carnal simply means, or worldly, carnal and worldly, interchangeable things. It means things pertaining to this world. And even the worship of God, even the worship of God at first, when it was set up under the old covenant, it was established on carnal things, on worldly things. And that is why you and I know, brothers and sisters, that this kind of worship was never the true worship of God. It was never the true worship of God. It was only intended to be a teaching tool and a stopgap measure. It was never what God intended to last. This is why when you come to John chapter 4, this passage is not often used as an expression of the new covenant, but I've come to recognize that it is one of the great statements pertaining to the new covenant. In John chapter 4, I'm going to read through the gist of this conversation Jesus had with this woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. The woman, of course, is steeped in carnal worship. She's steeped in carnal worship, like everybody else. Okay, that's what she grew up with. I mean, it's kind of like me. I'm in my 69th year of life. I'm not quite there at 69, but I'm in the year 69th year, and all my 69 years, I have been steeped in a certain kind of thinking, like most of us. You don't break out of that in a moment. It takes time. And this woman comes to Jesus, and she has her carnal mind. In this sense, I don't mean evil, I simply mean worldly. Her worship and her understanding are of this world. And so she asked the question, our fathers worship in this mountain. What is she concerned about? Place of worship, carnal, of this world. She's concerned about which mountain to worship on. You say that in Jerusalem is a place where men ought to worship. She's concerned about which location can you find God. Carnal worship. Jesus said unto her, woman, the hour is coming, the hour cometh, when you shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. And you say, what is the woman to make of this? Jesus is saying, you're not going to worship God in this mountain, and you're not going to worship God in Jerusalem. What? Are we going to stop worshiping God? I suppose that's the first idea that comes to her mind, because based on her religious background, it is unthinkable to center your worship on anywhere other than that mountain or Jerusalem. And Jesus says, the hour cometh, the hour is coming. And now is the hour has arrived, because with the coming of Jesus, it is the beginning of the new covenant. The system of types and representations is passing forever. So Jesus says the hour has now arrived when the true worshippers, and we can pause on every word because these are the words of our King, and these words are full of meaning, every one of them. Jesus says the true worshippers, and if you have true worshippers, what is he implying? He implies that they are false worshippers. Okay, there are people worshiping God who are false worshippers. They think they are worshiping God, but they don't know God. Neither does God know them, and they are worshiping God. And it's interesting that they are worshiping God in a particular way. I'll point out in just a moment. He says the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Now, based on what we looked at so far, what is the converse of spirit or spiritual? It is carnal or worldly. So when Jesus says the true worshippers, he's talking about people who worship the Father not in a carnal or worldly way. And he says the Father is seeking for those people to worship him. Now, in the context of the question, what he's saying is that, my dear lady, to try to worship God on the basis of place is a carnal endeavor. To try to worship God on the basis of location is a worldly endeavor. The hour has arrived when this is no longer applicable. God is done with that kind of worship. God wants people who worship him in spirit. It's based on your interaction with God on a mind or on a spirit level, and not on where your body is or what your body is doing. This is what he's saying. And he says God is looking for these kinds of people. That is why I'm so happy for those of us who are here this morning who can come together, because I know most of us, or all of us, hopefully, we understand that this is what God wants, and we are already seeking the Father in this kind of way, because these are the kinds of people God is looking for to worship him. This is why I say denominational worship can never please God, because people who worship in denominations are with the limitations of denominations. Let me put it that way, because sometimes I understand people can attend a certain place because they like the fellowship or something, but they are not bound there, and they don't feel a commitment that they have to be there. You might be free in your mind and you just put your body there because it's convenient. Okay, I'm not condemning anybody for that. But people who are bound, who think that God is located in this denomination or at this particular geographical spot, your worship is carnal. Your worship is of the world. And you are not the kind of person God is looking for to worship him, because you are the kind of person who will misrepresent God and who will lead people astray. You will do like the Jews. You will compass sea and land to make one proselyte. And when he's made, you make him fourfold more the child of hell than yourself. So Jesus finishes by saying that God is a spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth, not carnally, not of the world, but in spirit and also in truth. And the word truth here refers to reality, the reality of the thing, not the imitation or the representation or the model, but the true thing, the truth, reality. Now, I want to kind of wrap up my thoughts in the next 10 minutes. I have about 10 or 15 minutes left by just looking at a couple of other passages in Galatians and Colossians. In Colossians chapter 2 and verse 8, I want to start from verse 6 so you can get the context. Here's what Paul says. As ye have therefore received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk ye in him. He's telling you how to progress in the Christian life. He's telling you how to experience what some people call sanctification. They mean the walk where you develop in your Christian experience. Paul is telling you how to do it, and he says, look here, it's simple. The same way you started, continue. As you have received him, so walk in him. Somebody asks, now that I'm a Christian, where do I go from here? Where do you go? You have nowhere else to go. When you come to Christ, as you reach the beginning, you're at the end. There's no place to graduate to. You have no higher place to go. Because when you come to Jesus, you have come to the Father. It's God in Christ. So you have no other place to go. So Paul says, continue to walk in him. Rooted and built up in him. That's what we focus on. Building our relationship with him. Becoming more firmly grounded in him. And established in the faith as you have been taught, abounding therein with thanksgiving. Now he gives a warning. He says, beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy. What is philosophy? It's human reasoning and vain deceit, deceptiveness, meaningless deceptiveness. And look what he says, after the tradition of men. What is a tradition of man? It's a practice that human beings carry out generation after generation, so well established that it becomes something that appears to be unchangeable. People come to accept it as true because it is long established. But Paul says, don't let anybody interfere with your Christianity by pushing this upon you. And he says, after the rudiments of the world and not after Christ. Remember what we said about things of the world. They are carnal. It simply means things of the world. What he's saying is, in your Christian experience, don't let anybody push worldly kind of worship. And when he says worldly, we think bad. No, he doesn't mean bad. He means things that pertain to the flesh and to this life. To have a house of worship is not bad. To believe that this is the only place you can find God is bad. To have a fellowship is not bad. To believe that this fellowship is God's special dwelling place and you can't fellowship anywhere else, that is bad. This is carnality. This is worldly thinking. These are the rudiments of the world, to believe that God is located at a particular spot, to bring God down to the level of our humanity. I cannot be in more places than one. I have to limit God as I am limited. This is worship of the world. This is rudiments of the world. When Paul says this, he's focusing especially on the worship that was centered on the law. Because he says, he talks about what Jesus did. I wish we had time to examine the whole passage, but he says he blotted out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. In verse 16, he says, let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. Here he explains the whole two covenants. These things are a shadow. They are elements of the world. These things pass when the reality comes. The reality is the body is Christ. The body is Christ. These things are the shadow. These things are gone. Jesus says, God is looking, the hour has arrived, and God is looking for people to worship him in spirit and in truth. We move from the shadow, the elements of the world, and we go to the reality, which is Christ himself. I want you to notice how strong Paul is in verse 20. Look at verse 20. Wherefore, if you be dead with Christ from the rudiments of the world, you died to this world. Why? As though you are living in the world, why are you subject to ordinances? I want you to notice his argument. He's saying, why are you as a Christian subjected to the ordinances that relate to this flesh? And you died with Christ. You are no longer in the flesh. You no longer live in this world. Why are you still subject to these ordinances? What is he talking about? Look at the next verse. Touch not, taste not, handle not. He's talking about the religion that is based on touching and tasting and handling. He's talking about the religion that makes you believe that if you touch something, you have committed a sin. That if you taste something, it has offended God. He's saying these things, they are used and they die, they perish. They don't affect the spirit, which are all to perish with the using. But why are you subject to these things? After the commandments and the doctrines of men. Now, this is why, one of these days we really need to have a long talk about clean and unclean foods. And the reason why is because, many of our people have kind of made it almost a religion. They have made a religion out of what you eat. The biblical teaching is that food is not religion. But I agree that food is necessary. Eating carefully is necessary for your health. I agree. Good health is something the Christian wants because your body is God's tool. You want it to serve Him long. And besides, you want to be happy and healthy, even in this flesh. But it is not religion. This is the point of Paul, and it is the point of Jesus. Food is not religion. Don't make it into religion. Let it remain where it belongs, in the realm of health. That's why Jesus said there's nothing that enters into your mouth can defile you. He was not speaking about health. He was talking about religion, spiritual defilement. No food can defile you spiritually. If you don't agree with that, go and argue with Christ. But it can harm your health. And because we are Christians, even though these bodies are going back to the dust, right? So we are not here to live forever. But at the same time, while we have life, we give God thanks that we are able to serve Him and to give Him the best service. I don't like when my voice is going because I need it to share the gospel. I don't like when I'm feeling weak because when I lack energy, I can't deliver as capably as I think I would like to. I need my eyes to read, to study the Bible. I need my health. So I'm going to try to preserve it. But I'm not going to make it religion because when it's religion, I'll tell you something. When it's religion, you can't compromise. And where it comes to health, there are times I compromise. All right? I try to avoid using a lot of sugar, but every now and then I take a little something that is sweet, every now and then, right? It's not a sin. If it were a sin, I wouldn't do it. I try to get to bed early at night, but every now and then I have a late night. And it's not a sin because if it were a sin, Jesus sometimes went a whole night without sleeping. So we have to put things in balance. So this is what Paul is talking about. He says people come around and they try to govern your religion and they tell you, touch not, taste not, handle not. You couldn't touch the ark, you would drop dead. You know, one of the interesting things I have to think about is what if one day they find the Ark of the Covenant? What if one day they find the Ark of the Covenant? They say Jeremiah, according to the Maccabees, Jeremiah hid it in a cave somewhere. If they ever find the Ark of the Covenant and you actually get near to it, will you be afraid to touch it? It's an interesting thought because in the Old Testament, if somebody touched it, they dropped dead. But the priest could touch it and they didn't drop dead. And Moses could touch it and he didn't drop dead. And besides, this was something pertaining to the Old Covenant. Would we be bold enough to say this was of the elements of the world? And right now we don't live by touch not, taste not, handle not anymore. That era has passed. And so if I touch it, I won't drop dead. I just challenge you with that thought because this is what, as Brother Philip just put in the chat, the Philistines touched it and they didn't drop dead. So it's interesting. It has to do something with what God was trying to teach them at the time. But Paul says this kind of religion is over. And if you are dead with Christ, why you are still living by these things? He believes that if you allow people to drag you into this kind of religion, you are moving away from the simplicity that is in Christ. And because my time is almost up, let me just go to the final passage, Galatians 4, verse 3. And it's verses 3 and from verse 3 down to about, I'll read verse 3 and verse 9. The whole passage we could read profitably, but Paul says, when we were children, we were in bondage under the elements of the world. Again, he uses that phrase, elements of the world. Who is he referring to as we? I know we have been through this before, but I just want to reinforce. Paul is speaking to we who are God's people. We God's people. At one point in our history, we were children. When were we children? In the history of God's people, our childhood period was from Sinai to Calvary. At this point, God was dealing with spiritual children. He put them under tutors and governors. And who were these tutors and governors? If you go to the previous chapter, it tells you a tutor is a teacher. Go to the previous chapter, just in case anybody tries to confuse you. And in the previous chapter, it says in verse 24, wherefore the law was our schoolmaster. Another word for schoolmaster is tutor. The law was our tutor to bring us unto Christ. Go back to chapter 4. The, we were, the child is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the father. When we were children, we were in bondage, we were under tutelage, we were put under the control of the elements of the world. Those elements of the world that govern us and control us were the things of the law. To you people in this room, I can say that the things of the law were elements of the world. To the normal person who does not understand, I have just uttered a word of blasphemy. It will be a cause of warning people. Don't listen to this man, he's an apostate. But it's the truth of the word of God. The law had to do with behavior in this life. The law told you how to behave in this life. Don't steal, don't kill, don't covet, don't commit adultery. It never dealt with the inward things of the spirit, but only the outward things of the flesh. God put his people in a children's state under the elements of the world. The law was a schoolmaster. For what purpose? To bring us to Christ, because Christ was the end of the road. Because see what it says in verse 4. But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his son. This is the coming of Christ now. At this point, the law has done its job. Made of a woman, made under the law, that was Jesus, to redeem them that were under the law, no longer to be in bondage under the elements of the world, no longer under the schoolmaster, no longer treated as servants, that we might receive the adoption of sons. This is what it means to be free from the elements of the world. I understand and I agree. I'm going to tell you something that I've found out. I found out that people often have a difficulty in worshiping in the spirit. It's because we have become so accustomed to looking at the world and understanding the world through the lenses of worldly things. I hear people ask the question all the time. I hear people say, what you're teaching is unrealistic. Everything is run by law. How can you have a system that doesn't run by law? That is a question they ask. And I understand, because nobody in this world has ever lived in a system without law. They even say the universe is run by law. But they don't know what kind of law. They think the universe is run by 10 commandments. The universe is run by the law of the natural law. It's natural law that runs the universe, not 10 commandments. But anyway, but I understand why people find it difficult. When you set people free, they don't know what to do. Many times they go into anarchy. Many times they go into lawless behavior, because they are told that they are free, but they don't understand how to be free. The only freedom that is worthwhile and that can work is the freedom of making yourself the servant of God. I am free. I'm free from the law. I'm free to be anything I want to be. And the right way to use this freedom is to subject myself to Christ. When I am subject to Christ, I am fit to be free. I don't need a law. I don't need a system of government external. I don't need elements of the world, because Christ in me is enough of a government. I don't need anybody to watch me and walk around and tell me what to do, because I have Christ living in me. This is what it means to experience the new covenant. Many people have a challenge doing this because they divorce themselves from the law but they don't attach themselves to Christ. They put the cart before the horse. They're happy to know I'm no longer bound by the system of the law. But they neglect the other part, which is I am bound to Christ. And that is what I want all of us to understand, brothers and sisters. The final point I will make is to read from verse 9, because this is a solution many people take. You know, it's a vicious cycle at times. You say, okay, free from the law. You turn to Christ. You don't turn to Christ. You turn away from the law and you start trying to live, and you can't live. And you find out that the church or the fellowship is going into anarchy because people don't really know God. You know what people do? They go back to the law. They start making rules again and setting people under the system of carnal, worldly elements again. And that's what was happening to the Galatians. And Paul says in verse 9, Galatians 4 and verse 9, but now after that you have known God, or rather you are known of God. How turn you again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? In their case, it was worse because they had met Christ. But they were allowing these people to bring upon them again the elements of the world, and they were turning back to the ways of worldly worship. It was apostasy. You observed days and months and times and years. They had gone back to worshiping, keeping feast days and all that nonsense. I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. This is how Paul saw where these people were heading. So I know that I don't think that for most of us, the message this morning is dramatically necessary. I think and I hope that by God's grace, all of us who are listening to me this morning have been delivered from our dependence, our enslavement to that kind of thinking. But it is very necessary that we keep reminding ourselves, and also that we understand properly, because this, in my estimation, is one of the most important truths that you need to be able to teach to other Christians who are misguided. In my own experience, I was never free until I understood this. When I began to grasp this truth, I was liberated. You couldn't hold me down anymore. I was first set free from denominationalism, and then from denominational thinking, and then from subjection to other human beings, because I came to understand true worship, and I came to understand the necessity of this unbreakable relationship with Christ. So I hope and pray that for all of us this morning, the lesson is deeply rooted and that it is one that we won't forget. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for joining with me. I appreciate you very much. I'm going to have a... Yes, Brother Joel, you wanted to say?
Yeah, man, sorry. Just a quick question if you have time for it, because I don't know if
Go
you...
ahead. Go ahead.
All right, I just want to put down a marker. So if an individual was to eat pork, would you consider it a sin, or is it an issue of conscience based on what you just said?
Right. You take me into a subject that I would like to take a whole session and deal with, but I'm going to give you a quick answer, and some other time we'll discuss it more fully. The problem with pork eating for many people is that there is a command in the Bible, and that's how many people view life. If the Bible commands it, that's the end of the argument. The same Bible commands, if I can touch upon a delicate issue, the same Bible commands that when a woman is having her period, she's not to handle certain kind of things, and she's unclean for a certain period of time. The same Bible, and it's also a command. We adjust the one about women because we say it's very clear. It's not that God had something against women or against women at a certain time of the month. It all had to do with certain healthful practices. But we tend to put the pig in a different category. So we think that in some kind of way, a pig is kind of demon possessed. That if you touch pork, you have committed an unpardonable sin. And maybe it's the denomination that has caused this kind of mindset. But Pork eating is simply a matter of health. You don't want to put something in your body that can harm your health. It's simply that. And as I said earlier on, unhealthy practices are not a sin in a moral sense. It's just that it can harm your body. If you're careless about your body's health, you don't care about the temple of God, then that's an issue between your conscience and God, which turns it into a sin indirectly. But the same thing is true if you're unkind to your wife. It's a sin. If you're constantly going to bed late and the Lord makes you understand that this is not the best thing, it's a sin. Going to bed late is not a sin. When the Lord says, I don't want you to do it and you do it, it's a sin. Same thing about pork eating. If it comes to the place where, under some circumstances, it's necessary for you to eat pork, I won't argue about what those circumstances might be. Somebody will say, I've heard people say, I would prefer die first. Live by your conscience. But if you are speaking about biblically speaking and doctrinally speaking, is it a sin? My answer is no. No, the answer is no. But
Here's another example, David.
yes,
Here's another example. When Christ was walking on the Sabbath through the cornfield, when they brought the corn, those around thought it was a sin. But when he brought the corn, he was demonstrating it wasn't a sin to do that there and then.
exactly.
So
So, but as I said, it's a topic that I would like to deal with at greater length so everybody can understand it more fully. Because sometimes when you just say something, it creates more questions than answers. But because Brother Joel asked, I just give that what I hope is a quick
Thank you,
understanding.
David. Sorry to pull you down into that, man, but I appreciate the answer.
It's okay, Brother Joe. Hopefully we can be able to discuss it more fully in the near future.
Yeah, David.
Yes, Brother Kasika.
I wanted just to add a comment to what the brother is asking. I think I also had some thoughts concerning what you've said in relation to Romans 14:17, where it says the kingdom of God is not about eating and drinking, but about righteousness. So what you've given is some insights that I've been having for the past weeks. I've had that thought concerning food. Like the kingdom of God is all about righteousness and not necessarily drinking and eating. Thank you.
Yes, yes. I mean, I hope any of you don't go and start eating pork, but but I would like you to understand the principle, which I think is very important.